I have decided to respond to the so-called comedian Steven Crowder, who tries to claim that Hitler was both a liberal and a socialist. The truth, of course, is that he was neither a liberal or a socialist, and there is a very good reason why he and his movement are placed on the far right of the political spectrum.
Hitler. What do we hear about Hitler? He was
Super right wing.
right wing.
Right wing.
And he most certainly was. But we will get to that.
Nazi stands for National Socialist German Workers' Party. Okay? So put that in your back pocket. Now, let me get to something people will say. I know what you're going to say. National socialism, not democratic socialism like Bernie Sanders. There's a huge, one is fascism, right wing, one is not. They're both socialism.
We all know what he is trying to do here. He is trying to compare Hitler to Bernie Sanders. Well, the only US politician that Nazis favorably compared to Hitler was Ronald Wilson Reagan. Leon de Grau was an ardent National Socialist and a war criminal who fled to Franco's Spain after the Second World War. In Spain, he continued to praise Hitler and his government. In one of his papers entitled How Hitler Consolidated Power in Germany, he writes, Hitler believed in the importance of individual creative imagination and dynamism, in the need for every person of superior ability and skill to assume responsibility. He also recognized the importance of the profit motive. Deprived of the prospect of having his efforts rewarded, the person of ability often refrains from running risks. The economic failure of communism has demonstrated this. In the absence of personal incentives and the opportunity for real individual initiative, the Soviet command economy lagged in all but a few fields, its industry years behind its competitors. State monopoly tolls the death of all initiative and hence of all progress. For all men selflessly to pool their wealth might be marvellous, but it is also contrary to human nature. Nearly every man desires that his labour shall improve his own condition and that of his family, and feels that his brain, creative imagination, and persistence well deserve the reward. Because it disregarded these basic psychological truths, Soviet communism, right to the end, wallowed in economic mediocrity. In spite of its immense reservoir of manpower, its technical expertise, and its abundant natural resources, all of which ought to have made it an industrial and technological giant, Hitler was always adverse to the idea of state management of the economy. He believed in elites. Leon de Grau goes on to say this. Today, our whole era is dying economically because we have succumbed to fearful hesitation. Enrichment follows investment, not the other way around. Since Hitler, only Ronald Reagan has seemed to understand this. As president, he realized that to restore prosperity in the United States meant boldly stimulating the economy with credits and a drastic reduction in taxes, instead of waiting for the country to emerge from economic stagnation on its own. Leon de Grau considered himself to be an ardent National Socialist, yet he was a supporter of Reaganite capitalist economics. Why? Because he saw the similarities between Hitler's capitalist economic policies and Reagan's economic policies. That's right, a vicious anti-Semitic Nazi collaborator who referred to himself as the spiritual son of Adolf Hitler compared his beloved Fuhrer to old Ronald Reagan, who is the conservative god.
Okay. The United States is not a democracy. You throw around the term democratic as though it's noble. No. We're a constitutional representative republic.
America is a democracy. It's a representative democracy where voters elect candidates to represent them in the legislature. No different to democracy in the Weimar Republic, where Germans elected candidates to the Reichstag to represent them. In fact, as far as I know, representative democracy is the only form of democracy that currently exists. Now we get to the substance. I'm not wasting my time listening to Crowder's ridiculous ramblings, so I will go straight to his so-called source. Oh, what a surprise! The first image on the page is based on a lie. Hitler never said, "We are socialists." We are the enemies of the capitalist system, etc., that was written by Hitler's enemy Gregor Strasser, who was later executed on Hitler's orders. The first thing they listed supposedly proves Hitler was a socialist was that he promised more jobs during a period of high unemployment. Anyone that does that is clearly a socialist. Of course, that is rubbish. Conservatives from Ronald Reagan to Margaret Thatcher have campaigned on the employment issue. The article also states that most of their jobs were government jobs. That is not true. Most were employed by the German private sector. Let's go back to the Reaganite Nazi, Leon de Grau, who wrote, "Everywhere industry was hiring again, with some firms like Krupp IG Farben and the large automobile manufacturers taking on new workers on a very large scale. As the country became more prosperous, car sales increased by more than 80,000 units in 1933 alone. Employment in the auto industry doubled. Germany was gearing up for full production, with private industry leading the way. The new government lavished every assistance on the private sector, the chief factor in employment, as well as production. Hitler almost immediately made available 500 million marks in credits to private businesses. Now for price controls. Price controls were introduced in 1936 so the Nazi government could purchase armaments below the market value. The Conservative Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, also implemented price controls for the exact same reason, and so did FDR in the United States. Remember, the last president of the United States to introduce price controls was Richard Nixon during the oil shock in the early 1970s. Also, the current conservative government in Israel uses price controls, mainly to control the price of food. Many socialists are against the use of price controls and wage controls. Why? Because they can be used to keep wages low, as they were kept low in Nazi Germany. Indeed, leftist countries like Norway, where the largest company is publicly owned, does not have a minimum wage. Instead, it has strong trade union rights that allows workers to negotiate with employers in both the public and private sectors for better wages. Now this brings me to the so-called benefits workers received under the Nazi government. The right to strike was abolished, and so was collective bargaining for wages. As a result, workers' wages remained low, despite the massive increase in national income. The profits of the capitalists, meanwhile, massively increased. It was the capitalists who benefited most out of Hitler's government, not the workers who were often repressed. William Scherer, author of The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, noted that the share of national income enjoyed by capitalists rose from 17% to 26.6%, which is a massive increase. So, it was the capitalist class that benefited most out of the Nazi government. Workers, meanwhile, were repressed. The article also claims that building public roads and other forms of infrastructure is socialist, which would make conservative and capitalist nations like Japan and South Korea socialist nations. So it's quite a stupid point.
Everyone had a job, big education, free daycare. You had basically an entire generation who were raised by the state.
I have come to the conclusion that Crowder is getting quite a bit of his information from Kitty Wertman, the nutjob who used to speak at Tea Party rallies. I have commented on her rubbish before.
We got a very, very good law, we thought, the Equal Rights Amendment. Well, equal rights for women. Haven't we heard that here too?
Na, hast du das bekommen? Was hast du Schönes bekommen? Flieger? Na, wirst du auch ein Flieger werden? Was? Wenn du groß bist, was wirst du denn? Was wirst du? Ach, du bist ja Mädel.
I thought it was a terrible fate to have been born a girl.
So in that comment, she insulted all German women who suffered under the rampant sexism of the Nazis. Why did I show the clip? because Kitty Wertmann claims that women were encouraged to go into the workforce. Women were not expected to work. They were expected to be mothers and raise their children. Hitler was not only economically capitalist, he was also very socially conservative.
Sagte oft, Sie wollen die Frau aus allen Berufen drücken. Ich will ihr nur die Möglichkeit im weitesten Ausmaß verschaffen, heiraten zu können und eine eigene Familie mitgründen, helfen zu können und Kinder bekommen zu können, weil sie dann, und das ist nun meine Überzeugung, unserem Volk natürlich am allermeisten nützt. Denn das
And there was a national curriculum in Nazi Germany, just like there is in every country.
Nationalized healthcare.
German universal healthcare was introduced under Otto von Bismarck during the reign of Wilhelm I, who was dead before Hitler was born. This is common knowledge. To say Hitler invented universal healthcare, as many conservatives do, is just utterly deceitful.
Up to an 80% tax.
Germany actually had much lower tax rates than Churchill's Britain, which were well over 90%. Why were they so high? Because both capitalist countries were fighting a war. Before the war, income tax in Germany was quite low. Now, no one ever calls Churchill a socialist because of his extremely high tax rates, because people know that the tax money was going towards the war effort. It was just common sense.
Gun control, of course.
Hitler actually made it easier for German citizens to own guns. See the 1938 weapons law.
Abortion was radically pro-abortion.
Actually, Hitler was the opposite. That is why he set up the Reich Office to combat homosexuality and abortion in 1936.
Blaming on the 1%. Back then, the 1% were Jews.
It's the right that picks on religious minorities, not the left. When the left talks about the 1%, they are talking about the rich. And the German rich were on Hitler's side. They liked Hitler, and Hitler liked them.
Krupp had been a loyal Nazi. He helped fund Hitler's rise to power. He gave signed copies of Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, to his German workers. And Hitler reserved a special place for Krupp and his employees at the Nuremberg rallies.
Professor. Now, why is this so important? Going back to representative government. Well, Hitler used the idea of democracy, mob rule, to infringe on the rights of the minority.
Once again, Hitler despised democracy and even likened it to Marxism.
Jews in Germany made up less than 1%. They used that a lot, the 1% rhetoric. Changed Germans to working class. You have an economic version of exactly the same thing.
This shows a lack of self-awareness. It is the right that attacks religious minorities, not the left. Religious minorities are often powerless. They were powerless in Germany, just like religious minorities are powerless in America. The rich, however, were powerful in Nazi Germany and are powerful in the US.
The idea that Hitler was right-wing, no.
Wrong. Hitler was as right-wing as you could possibly get. He was an anti-communist.
gegen den Marxismus wurde damals zum ersten Mal zu einem Kampfziel erhoben. Damals gelobte ich mir zum ersten Mal als unbekannter Eiserner diesen Krieg zu beginnen und nicht zu ruhen, bis endlich diese Erscheinung aus dem deutschen Leben beseitigt sein würde.
He hated multiculturalism. He privatized state-owned industries. He privatized banks, steel and mining, shipyards, shipping lines, minority railway shares, and even public services. In fact, the word privatization was coined to describe Nazi economic policy. That is where the term privatization comes from, Nazi Germany. He was against workers' rights, he was anti-abortion, anti-feminist, and he was pro-big business. Undeniable.